my audio is on. All right, let's check that audio. I'm going to start recording. And I'm going to turn off these things. All right, I think we are live. So tonight we're joined with my friend Len, who has taught me a lot of things about economics and software. And before we go there, Yusuf, I forgot my candid line. Hey, we're the Canton Coders. We are a nonprofit based out of Michigan that's worldwide now. We focus on helping people find happiness through coding. Everything we do is 100% free. We collect no money from anyone. And you can join anything we do for free at cantoncoders.org and Slack at cantoncoders.org. Tonight we're joined by my friend Len, who is going to talk about economics and money. Len just slipped off the screen. We are live, so maybe he's having technical difficulties. But, Len, if you'd like to come back, that would be awesome. If not, we'll kill some time.
Whoops.
We've lost Len. Hey, so...
And he's back.
And Len is coming back in. So we'll talk about what's going on. Hey, check out events.cantoncoders.org. If you're watching this live right now, it's where our events are. We are doing a lot of hands-on coding sessions. We like to think that Wednesday night is a little more strategic, management, director level conversations when we have talks about theory and how we're going to move forward in our careers as software developers. But on Tuesday nights, we do live coding. Everyone's welcome. So if you haven't written code, come join. If you've written code for 50 years, Camille will be there because she's written their code for about 55 years. So you'll have someone to look up to. And on Saturday mornings, we're doing Saturday School, where we're going to give you coding assignments, and we'll review them and give you feedback on how to get through coding interviews. And that is all through kindness. We are not mean. We just want to be happy. Now that Len is back, and that's okay, we are live. We want to welcome Len. So Len is a friend of mine. He has taught me about 87% of what I know about software economics, which has helped me myself find a better job where I find happiness through economics and software. So I thought it would be amazing if Len could come share tonight about economics and software. And anything else, Len, to give an introduction? I know you're going to introduce yourself, and we need to make you a co-host. Yusuf, can you do that so he can reshare?
I can't make him a co-host.
Can you not? Oh,
Only
no,
you
we
can.
had Zoom-pocalypse.
Yeah, we had one of those. Zoom doesn't seem to like my machine, so I got a nice little blue screen of death and had to recover from that. So,
well, we.
All right, let's see if I can share.
Can you do it now?
I think so.
So if you have any questions on LinkedIn and stuff, jump on our slack.cantoncoders.org. That's the best way to get a question to Len. There are some people in the studio audience, and they will be popping up questions too. Len, how do you want to receive those?
I think via the chat would be fine for now, and or via Slack. I'm good either way. Well, good evening, everyone.
Go ahead, Len. Go ahead. We're live.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Len Greski, and I lead the architecture practice at Leading Agile. And tonight, our discussion is about the economics of software development. Now, I initially wanted to name the presentation after a famous song, but given that the censors wouldn't allow it because we don't want to get censored on YouTube or LinkedIn, we're going to talk about send lawyers, coders, and money. And so, starting out, there's a big picture that product development and software development are all about the creation of value. And well-crafted software generates value in at least 4 different ways. And that value can be measured. First, it can generate value for customers. And well-crafted software with simple architectures can enable customer experiences and products that customers love to use. And when, in an economy where many products are designed around the more you use the product, the more revenue and profit are generated, a product that customers love to use increases the lifetime value of a customer for that product. Another area where it adds value is in the area of profitability, and that well-designed software is flexible. It enables rapid change at a low cost. And when you can change quickly at a low cost, over time, the total cost of ownership is lower. And what that does is it increases profitability, because the less you spend to build and maintain your product and operate it, if given a level of revenue, the more profits left over. Next area is under reliability, and that if your product is not available for people to use, then often you're not making money from it, and therefore well-crafted software is highly reliable. It has horizontal scaling, component independence, a lot of these things that we teach in coding practices, like the solid principles. When you do that, your products and software services are more reliable, and that reduces the amount of money it costs to support things in production, and you have to maintain it less. There was one service that I worked on that was an order processing service that took orders from a website and processed them into a fulfillment system. And if that piece was down, the company wasn't making money. And earlier in my career, I was a consultant, and I was asked to evaluate this piece of software because it was failing every day, and its ability to process orders was less than the orders they were getting on an hourly basis, and they were falling behind, and time is money. And eventually we were able to refactor that service in a way where it was highly reliable, and the redesigned service ran for more than a decade without maintenance because it was so highly scalable. And that business grew by more than an order of magnitude, using that piece of software. And then finally, performance. When you have elegant architectures and a high degree of software craftsmanship, it reduces things like chattiness in your application services, and less chatty equals faster performance. And I've worked on products where you can get performance gains as high as 80%. And, at that level, you can run 5 times the workload through it, at its original throughput. And when you get higher performance, you get a lower cost per unit of work. And in a system that requires, if you're off the cloud and you've got to buy chunks of hardware, being able to get more out of your hardware is highly valuable. Or if it's cloud-based and you can, and you reduce the cost, you can reduce the cloud charges because you need fewer resources to run a given workload. So the bottom line is, wherever you go and whatever products you're working on as a software developer, you want to take Rod Tidwell's advice: show me the money. And as a developer, you should be asking your project managers, your product owners, your product managers about the things that you're working on and how they generate economic value. And if you're working with product owners and product managers that can't quantify the economic value, you ought to ask some tough questions about, why are we building this? Sometimes those are uncomfortable, but the reality is that if you're doing your job effectively as a software developer and you're regularly building working tested product and making it available to customers, that gives you the credibility to start asking these show me the money questions. Now, I'm going to talk next about value from a chief technology officer's perspective. Now, this is quite an eye chart, but this is illustrative of the kinds of content that are shared with senior executives at large companies when they need to make decisions about an investment with multiple alternatives. And this particular case study is the replacement of an e-commerce platform where you have 5 different scenarios to replace it compared with the quote, do nothing scenario. And the first row of bubbles towards the top of the chart, where it says TCO, total cost of ownership over 5 years, you can see that the 5 alternatives range in total cost of ownership between $188 million and $217 million. And the do nothing scenario costs $350 million. Now, the total costs get broken out into one-time costs and ongoing costs over a 5-year period. And we put some Harvey Ball charts to show what percentage of the desired capability each solution would provide, and highlighted some risks. And as you can see on the chart, option 1 has the lowest total cost of ownership, and at this level of abstraction, the best risk portfolio. Now, there are a lot of numbers on this slide, but there are only 2 that really matter. The bottom number in that first column, 99 million, represents the recurring cost to operate option 1 over a 5-year period. And the number in the upper right, 350 million, is the amount of money that this organization would spend to run its current platform for 5 years. So if you subtract the 99 million from the 350, the benefit of implementing option 1 is $251 million over a 5-year period, that you can increase the economic value by changing platforms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this particular business had about $1 billion a year in revenue with 5% operating earnings. So it's like after all the dust settled, and you paid for everything to get the 1 billion, you had about $50 million left. And so this particular investment would double the profitability of this business unit. And the benefits for this particular project were so compelling that it received CEO level approval at a Fortune 50 company within 30 days, even though the project was not in the annual investment budget. So this was a completely unbudgeted project that got bumped ahead of a bunch of existing funded in the backlog projects because its value is so compelling.
Len, are you saying that this is real data that you used before as an executive?
Yeah, it's close to it. I mean, it's been Greek somewhat to protect the guilty, but but these are sort of rough order of magnitude, content, and these are the types of decisions that get made at big companies, right? So now the next case study I want to talk about is a question from our friend Desperate in Sunnyvale. Why won't they fund my project? And the answer is bad projects don't get funded. And when we talk about that, here's a sample project with where the benefits case is $300 million in incremental gross profit over a 5-year period, and the cost is $150 million in total cost of ownership, and so seems kind of interesting, right? You've got $300 million in incremental profit, $150 million in 5-year TCO, and gee, it seems like this thing's going to make $150 million over a 5-year period. Well, it's not quite so simple. is that you have to look at when you spend the money and when you get the incremental profit. And typically on a lengthy project, the benefits are backloaded, and so you have to account for the time value of money. And what we mean by a bad project is when you account for the time value of money, a bad project is one where its rate of return is lower than the cost to build and maintain it and operate it, plus some hurdle rate. And companies vary. Some companies will fund projects based on whether the investment is better than their weighted average cost of capital. Other companies will look at a range between weighted average cost of capital and some ideal return on invested capital that they'd like to achieve. And when you create a high level model like this, you need to include maintenance and operating expenses. And as I've seen working with scores of large companies, many of them have big weaknesses in their funding models because they will design their investments around the labor to build something, but they don't account for the software and hardware costs, and very often they don't include the maintenance and operating expenses. And so for this hypothetical project, you have a range of hurdle rates from 8.8% to 15%, and at both of those hurdle rates, the net present value, like, are you better off investing in this investment than getting investing it in something else that would get you an 8.8% return? For this project, you're better off investing in something else. And of course, the net present value is even more negative at a 15% hurdle rate. And when you just look at its internal rate of return, like ignoring hurdle rates, the internal rate of return is negative. So this is a bad project, and most executives would not fund something like this. Now, as in your role as a developer, you ought to ask questions about, what are we going to spend on this? How long does it take to get the initial minimum viable product to customers? Because a value of having frequent delivery of working tested product is that the benefits show up sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And when the benefits show up sooner, you're not as severely penalized by the hurdle rate, which compounds in later years of a 5-year statement of cash flow. So now when we drill down on this potential project a little further, the hypothetical business is in May 2018 had a 2.49% annual rate of inflation, and assuming that the current sales from this business are about 15 billion a year in year zero, you can actually model out with a scenario of the baseline sales, the gross profit, operating expenses, and the operating profit, and model that out over time. And then when you look at it from the perspective of the rate of inflation, is just the rate of inflation alone is going to generate incremental gross profit of over 840 million all by itself, which is sort of an interesting thing. And then when you look at the actual sales lift from this particular project modeled at an incremental 300 million over 5 years, its actual sales growth is only 0.86%, or it's less than half the rate of inflation. And putting together a model like this, you can do it in a few hours. And typically what happens in big companies is people spend all kinds of effort planning and doing software evaluations and meeting with vendors before they do math like this. And something like this is not going to get funded. And this is also how you smoke out the salespeople that want all kinds of new capabilities, but are not really willing to put skin in the game to commit to incremental sales in order to make a big investment like this viable. So we've been talking quite a bit about total cost of ownership. And in this next slide, if you're looking at a software application, you basically have costs in two categories. There are one-time costs and ongoing costs. And the one-time costs can get broken out into things like labor and non-labor costs. And there are various categories of non-labor costs. And typically with labor costs, they get broken out as employees and contractors, and then a bucket for overhead. And depending on how big the companies are, they may track overhead in multiple categories like project-related overhead and non-project related overhead. And typically when you do a total cost of ownership calculation, it's done over some time horizon like 5 years. And it includes things like one-time and ongoing costs, labor and non-labor costs, and it's debatable about whether you include overhead charges from centralized support function. So your mileage may vary, but at the end of the day, you need to calculate a bunch of these things in order to know what the software is going to cost you over its life cycle, because there are studies that say that a software application may actually cost 10 times its initial development cost over its life cycle. So if you're going to spend $10 million to build something, are you planning for $100 million in total life cycle costs? And if you're getting your project funded based on the 10 million, and you're really signing your company up for $100 million in costs over, say, a 5 or 8 year period, that's not healthy. And as someone who, if you're proposing projects, you don't want to do that.
Makes sense.
So another caveat with consideration around calculating things like total cost of ownership is that it's better to have an approximate answer to the right question than an exact answer to the wrong one. And this quote's from John Tukey, a famous statistician who invented the fast Fourier transform and did a bunch of other really cool work. And so the key here is when you're doing these kinds of calculations, don't get too caught up in the details. So for example, our example about the B2B scenario with $300 million in incremental gross margin and $150 million in 5-year costs, you can have some debate about the exact numbers in each of those cells, but the storyline of is this thing going to make money or not isn't going to change very much unless you put like all 300 million in year one, which is not likely, right? So you need to know where you're going to invest the time in detail and how to make the numbers good enough that they're defensible in an executive presentation. So, when you look at total cost of ownership, you can use it to make a bunch of decisions. Things like, where do you require consistency in the customer experience? Those are going to be, opportunities to take software modules and refactor them and centralize them so that as different experiences use the same business services, the customers will get the same experience. Where are there areas where you need to localize the customer experience to achieve the product fit that you need? Where might we centralize things? Because it's a service that a bunch of people are going to use. Where do we allow things to be locally controlled, right? When you have products that need to behave differently in Asia than they do in the United States or Europe, you're making these kinds of centralization, decentralization decisions, and you need to understand how they impact the total cost. So when you're centralizing, then you may be forced to accept certain limitations. But there are areas where centralization may actually increase your agility. Then you'll want to look at how much localization can be supported by the benefits derived from a particular business capability or value stream. Like if you have something that's English language based and you make it available in Mandarin because it will increase your usage by an order of magnitude, and that has a material effect on sales through your capability, you may want to invest in the localization. Then, like we said earlier about for every dollar you spend building, you spend 10 in after you build it. What does the build cost predict about the total cost of ownership? And then we need to look at things like, with relatively simple models, you can ask questions like, how much can we spend on this business capability before the spend is not economically viable? Another question is, how fast must the business capability ramp up benefits? And this is a hint at scalability and reliability in order to exceed the organization's expected investment hurdle rate. And then finally, where are things that the architecture is going to force you to orchestrate work across products, and what's the cost of the orchestration? But if you don't know the total cost of ownership of your product or your service or your business capability, you can't answer these questions. And then as a team member, you're not helping your product partners out very much to help them make the kind of economic trade-offs they need to get the highest quality product that maximizes the amount of work not done, because you know where the value is and you deliver the most valuable stuff first. You're making it harder for your product partners to be able to structure the work in that manner. So let's make this personal. We've thrown a lot of numbers at you. We've talked in things that's like, hey, Len, I'm not in the boardroom. I'm not, looking at, $100 million investments. What does this have to do with the price of rice on eBay? Well, each one of us, as a developer, we need to understand the value of what we work on. And one of the things I do when I coach people, team members, particularly early career team members, is this thing that I call the 3 R's of career development. That is, what do people get paid for? And if you're a developer, you're thinking that you get paid for your expertise, whether it's in Java or .NET or React or Python, or pick your technology, Azure, Amazon Web Service, Ruby, Python, R, whatever, but the reality is, when you abstract up, people get paid for 3 things. One is, generally speaking, the more people or resources that a person manages, the higher their compensation is. So managers get paid more than individual contributors. Directors typically get paid more than managers. VPs typically get paid more than directors, and so on. So one way to get, to increase the compensation in your career is to develop the skills to be able to manage people and grow the number of people you're managing. Next is, people get paid to manage risk. And the ability to both identify and mitigate risks the mitigation is important because, you know, just because you can identify the risks is like, okay, I have this hot smoking mess. Now what do I do about it, right? And you'll be able to influence people a lot more if not only can you identify the risk, but you can also actually help the company figure out how to get beyond those risks. And therefore people who can mitigate risks are very valuable in the market, which enables people in certain individual contributor roles, i.e. that they don't have armies of people directly reporting to them in a functional or formal organization structure, is that those people can still get compensated really well based on their ability to manage risk. So this is why project managers, architects, system engineers, you know, even though they may be individual contributors, they may be more highly compensated than the typical individual contributor role. And then finally, last and not least, is the third R, revenue. Is that roles that have accountability for revenue tend to get paid well for two reasons. One is their effectiveness is easy to measure. You have a sales target every quarter. Did you achieve that? Yes or no? It's a fairly straightforward math problem. So every quarter in a sales organization, you know, the leaders know who's on plan, who's beyond plan, where the gaps are in the plan, and whether an individual seller's gap closure plan is going to be sufficient to close that gap. The other thing is, and this is sort of a personality type thing, is that salespeople get paid really well because they deal with a lot of rejection, right? If you've ever been in a role where you've had to call people and ask for things, that's hard. It's particularly if that thing you're asking for is money. And so salespeople, the people who are really gifted at sales are often those people who have a high capacity to deal with rejection and not take it personally. So as you're thinking about your career, regardless of where you are in, your early career, mid-career, more experienced part of your career, you can always look at what am I doing now? What's the gap between what I'm doing now and where I want to be? And which of these R's is it going after? Because an important piece of career advice that many people do not follow is never take a job unless you think you can be in the top 10% of performance within 18 to 24 months of taking a job. And that advice is out of a book called Top Grading that's actually written for hiring managers about how to hire the top 10% of performance at any given salary level. But there's, in the older versions of the book, it's in its at least its third edition now. And in editions, the first two editions, it actually had a section called Top Grading for individuals. And the question was posed, as an individual, how do I make sure that I'm top grading myself? Meaning that I'm always in the top 10% of performance. And the tough thing is, don't take jobs just because it's got a big salary increase. Right? You want to know where your skills are, what's the market value for those skills, and be comfortable living within the means of whatever your skill level and set of talents are, because then that gives you flexibility to balance your life. But often there are a lot of early career people that just go after what's the thing with the next big salary bump. And if you're not a high performer, when cuts happen, as they inevitably do in around economic downturns, like many folks in the Canton Coders audience have experienced this year, you're better equipped to be resilient in a downturn if you haven't put yourself in a job where you're a B or C player. Um, so now, how does this relate to the economics of software development? Well, as a developer, you need to learn how to quantify the value of well-crafted software using your current or past work. So you should look at the stuff that's on your resume, and can you turn it into cost reductions, revenue increases, efficiency gains, velocity gains, right? So, in a development perspective, if you're working on a development team and you have implemented agile practices and are able to demonstrate that your velocity and throughput are increasing, you can actually calculate the monetary value of that incremental throughput. And if you aggregate it up over a year's worth of sprints, it adds up. Next is you should proactively manage which of the R's to pursue given your talents and interests. And don't just let decisions happen to you. Plan out proactively, and as you're planning that out, figure out where you can get help, what networking you need to do, what mentors you need to cultivate, so that people can help you develop the skills that you need, so that you can demonstrate your skills solving bigger and more complex problems. Third is knowing the economic value of your work, highlighting it on your resume, and being able to talk about it in detail during interviews. So, I've looked at thousands of resumes in my career, technical resumes, business resumes, data science resumes, because I have a background in that. And even the data scientists rarely quantify the economic value of what they're doing on their resumes. In fact, I had a coaching discussion. I was coaching a gentleman who had a PhD in data science, and he was top 1% on a reputation on Stack. And his resume had nothing about economic value. And so after coaching, he made a bunch of changes in his resume. He began to start to think about that. But if you don't know the value, particularly for past jobs, this is where you need to phone a friend and find out, like, whether it's a former manager or other colleagues, to go back and reconstruct the value of the stuff that you did on your resume. I once had a situation where, in a past job, the person that I hired to take my old job, a number of years later, was looking for a new job, and he had not quantified the value of the work that he had in that the job that I had placed him in. And so he called me kind of desperately, like, I need to be able to explain this stuff. Can you help me out? Now, fortunately, I was able to help him out, but ideally, you don't want to have to phone a friend to be able to figure out what the economic value was of your job 3 jobs ago. And so one thing that you can take away from this conversation, like after the video ends, is go look at your resume, figure out how to put at least one economic value number on each of your, each of the things on page 1 of your resume as soon as possible.
And if you need help with resume, we will help you here. Join our Slack.
That's right. So you can get help on Canton Coders on Slack with some of that. But it's really important. And so I will respond to a question or a point that says all good points, but the ability to quantify one's skills is a competency in itself, and not one everyone is that reflected. That's absolutely right, Joe Bear. Thank you for that point. And this is where it's important to get help. And
Here.
and that you can get help here, but the key thing that requires is the ability to be teachable. And now, fortunately, most software developers are relatively teachable. There are a few, there are a few out there that think that whatever they finished in their undergraduate degree program is all they need to learn for the next 40 years, and that then it's hard to teach them anything new. But most developers have a creativity and a passion for learning, and even as people progress into executive and senior executive roles, a lot of those people are still continuous learners. And gasp, some of us even still code. And also, Joe Bear, thank you for the comment about economic value and the need to avoid being a worker bee mentality. One of the things I found in coaching team members is when they understand the economic value, actually they get a lot more excited about their work, because when you can explain the results, your work has more meaning. And for the people who volunteer in creating content and organizing Canton Coders, there's a value. Joel was talking earlier about there have been 50 people that have received new jobs through Canton Coders and the networking and the job fairs, and the folks behind Canton Coders are really excited about that, because they feel like they're making a difference in the community, and the quantity, being able to quantify the number of people that have gotten jobs through Canton Coders means that the work that they're doing is measurable. And it's a lot of fun to do things and actually see measurable results out of them. And then finally, the last point here is, when you have a choice about things to work on stuff that has clear economic value. And whether it's a product or an application or some other type of solution, is really figure out, does this have economic value? How are they quantifying it? What does success look like? And work on things that have clear value. So, for example, early in my career, I did market research, and I was a research statistician in a market research company, and we had an early, what we now call data product in the data science business, and we in order to close a contract, I needed to do an analysis to show how our data product essentially correlated with a consumer packaged goods manufacturer's internal data. And I was able to show that the data was highly correlated and could show what was being purchased in different regions of the country and different grocery stores and things like that. And the timeliness of the information and its granularity made it much more valuable than the centralized manufacturing data that they were presently using to make decisions. And at that point in time, that allowed my company to close a multi-million-dollar sale to that particular company. And I was able to know what the value of the work I did was because it closed a multi-million-dollar sales contract. And so wherever you can, whether you're working on something like an internal enterprise resource planning system, it's like, what are the efficiencies that are being generated by the ERP system versus people doing things manually? How do you quantify it? How frequently do they happen? and to be able to then talk about the capabilities, the features you're building, and how they contribute to economic value. And where you have a choice, work on stuff, always choose more valuable rather than less valuable, even if it's riskier. And this is where, as you know, as an individual, you need to make some trade-offs of, how much risk am I willing to take? And again, going back to the 3 R's, is that people are have a better appetite, better at managing risks, are more likely to be able to grow faster in their careers and achieve higher compensation levels. So in closing, the big picture, C-level decisions are driven by economics and strategy. And as software developers, when we elegantly design things, when we have effective architectures, and we deliver with great craft. When I use the word craft, I think about Ron Jeffries, and I remember him tweeting once that in the end, the only thing that remains is craft. Like, how effective as a craftsperson are you in software development? And that point really resonated with me, and because when we build things of wonder and excellence, elegant, well-designed code, runs like a scalded dog, scales at low cost, it generates value, and it's a lot of fun. Is that being able to lead teams that have a passion for high quality, measurably valuable work is just a lot of fun. And finding that value and quantifying it as you grow your career is really important, because that is how you earn the right to solve bigger problems. Because most companies struggle with quantifying value. Next is that as a developer, you've got to know the value of what you're working on. And then finally, the more you can do that and demonstrate the ability to see value, quantify it, and deliver value through working tested product that's frequently delivered to customers, will distinguish you in the market. And with that, I'll open it up to Q&A.
Just before we do Q&A, first of all, I want to thank you, Len. I invited Len here tonight because I took what, I've done what Len's done economically in the past without clarity. Took what Len did, rolled it in, went and did it at a company, and then got picked up at my dream job because I could do this. So thank you, Len. You helped me get me my dream job because this actually works. Before we do any questions, just want to remind everyone we are live on the internet. So do not ask anything that would break NDAs. Please do not identify your employer. And please do not get anything that'll get us sued. If you would like to ask any serious questions, we'll turn off the recording and turn off the streaming. And Len will give you better advice. But before we turn off the stream, are there any questions that we can ask that are better for the recording long term? When someone's watching this in a year, right? I have a couple questions, but before I ask those, does anyone in the audience have any questions? Feel free to type them in the chat if you don't want to come off mute.
Put it in Slack, wherever you feel comfortable.
Yep. I have one, Len.
Go ahead.
Every developer says, I want to do a rewrite because this code is terrible. How would I economically talk about that? I want to rewrite my VB6 app, and I want to rewrite it to C#. What's the quickest way to figure out if that's valuable? Or is that too big of a question without a whiteboard?
Well, the first question would be would be around, how is the thing performing now?
Okay, wonderful. I just don't like VB6.
Well, if it's performing wonderfully, if the end users love it and the it's operates in production. It has a high availability. It's got good response time. Then there's marginal value in removing technical debt just for the sake of removing technical debt. Now, if the application is always crashing, now you've got another scenario, because what's the value of getting it to crash less? And so how many incidents occur per unit of time? So for example, I'd mentioned the order processing service that I worked on many years ago. That service caused like hundreds of thousands of dollars a day in lost value.
Okay.
And when it was originally built, the original designers spent probably $500,000 or $600,000 building this thing. And now the original designer, it was object oriented, it was written in Java, and the correct, quote, theoretically correct object oriented design had an object map of 22 objects to make an order. And it's an object, so an object needs to know how to save itself. So every one of those 22 objects knew how to save itself, which meant it had a database connection. And so every time you wanted to instantiate an order out of the database, this application would spin up 22 database connections, go grab the 22 objects and assemble it into an order. Well, if you had 100 orders to process, you've just generated 2,200 database connections. And back in the early aughts, the typical thing to send data from a website into some fulfillment system was you'd run batches periodically. And so this thing was on a 5-minute batch cycle, and so every 5 minutes the thing was constantly generating, allocating, and deallocating database connections. Now, because it was causing production outages, there was a lot of value in eliminating that technical debt. And so I worked with a very small team. When we actually looked at the problem, that the right answer was not a 22 object map where every object knows how to save itself. The right answer was one database connection, 3 SQL queries, and once the queries were in RAM, basically traversing the 3 query outputs to render the orders, and the application went from being able to process 5 or 6 orders a minute to thousands. And the cost to rewrite it was about $80,000.
That's pretty cheap.
So and it eliminated production outages, so that you could calculate the economic value of that debt removal by the lost, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month in errors and rework that were caused by the original service being down.
Cool. What other questions?
This is where you've got to have self-discipline. Is that if something works and it doesn't require a lot of maintenance, that highly unlikely to be worth rewriting it to do the exact same behavior in a more elegant way.
Are there other questions? Thanks, Len.
Yeah, I have a question. So as a software developer, which one of those 3 R's, or how would I quantify my value in terms of those 3 R's for development, career development.
What one did you prioritize, or are you trying to ask for a raise?
Yeah. So, which one would I prioritize? And yes, obviously raise, right?
Well, maybe not, because the what you want to optimize is what jobs am I going to be in the top 10% of performance within 18 to 24 months after I started. And if none of those are in the sales area, you can scratch that R off your list.
Okay.
Right. And this is where a great deal, and going back to one of Joe Bear's points about not everyone is self-reflective. This is where sometimes you need outside feedback. You need people to give you feedback, whether it's through doing things like personality assessments and getting feedback from team members about what you do well and areas where you could improve. So, for example, I'm not, like, personality-wise, a very detailed person. And in fact, like, my score on detail orientation on personality tests is usually so low and is very low. And then I score extremely high on intuition. Thanks, Nate. Thanks for joining us, Nate, and have a good evening. So there was one situation where a bunch of us were, as a group, took a set of psychological assessments, and afterwards, I met with the organizational psychologist, and she looked at my scores and was kind of shocked at, like, how did you get in this kind of role? Because you make all your decisions with intuition, and, like, nothing is analytical. And I kind of chuckled, and I responded with the questions like, well, would you draw the same conclusions if you knew that I have a master's degree with a concentration in research methods and statistics? I taught inferential statistics at the University of Illinois, and I've mentored over 100,000 data science students. And the organizational psychologist is like, totally, she's a strange look, like, what? I said, yes. It's like, what you're explaining is that my personality is like, I'm highly intuitive, very creative, not detail oriented. However, in order to do the work I do, I have to have a certain level of tolerance for work I don't like. And when I do math, I know the math's got to add up. And so there's a difference between skills that you can learn and roles that you can play and your natural gifts, talents, and desires and your personality characteristics. So, for me, one of the challenges I have is, when I have to do detail work, I will do it with sufficient detail to make it right. However, if I'm, like, always doing excruciatingly detailed work, at some point I get to the point where it's like, I just, I got to step away from it because I just don't like all those details. And so those are trade-offs that you have to make for certain jobs. You just have to put in, the effort to do the detail work. And some things, anything that's worth doing well is worth doing it not well while you learn it. And you have to have enough discipline to be comfortable with not doing something perfectly well until you develop that craft. And I forget which Malcolm Gladwell, was it Outliers book that talks about the 10,000 hour rule. where, in
Mhm.
order to be really good at something, you got to spend 10,000 hours on it. And so, it's important to think about what are you willing to put the 10,000 hours in on? And at the end of the 10,000 hours, are you going to like it enough to keep doing it? Right? It's like the guy who goes to law school, spends 3 or 4 years, gets a JD, works like a galley slave to pass the bar exam, and then doesn't want to be in court. It's like, what do you do with that? Right? And so this is where it's not just about getting more compensation, it's about the opportunities to do things that make more of an impact, so that when you're dealing with the hard stuff, it's fun. And I've had a lot of roles where I've had really, really high pressure, like building a set of digital experiences that debuted in an opening ceremony of the Olympics. And if that year URL didn't work at the end of the first ad block, scores of people were going to get fired. Right? There are some people that are not comfortable managing that level of risk. But when you manage it, and the updated application, after having been ripped to shreds by the senior VP 30 hours before the start of the Olympics, and you're actually hit Akamai 9 minutes before the ad airs and everything works, it's kind of fun.
You have a weird sense of fun, Len.
Well, it's a couple weeks of sheer terror, but at the end of it, when you're
If it
sitting
works,
there,
it's fun.
watching the ad on the Olympics, and when when the URL shows up and you type it in on your browser and hit enter and it works, that's a lot of fun.
What other questions do we have? And we'll turn off the recording here for a minute. That way everyone can feel a little more safer to talk. Anything else? So for the live stream, thank you so much, Len. Len hangs out in our Slack channel on slack.can'tcoders.org. Feel free to join, and is it okay if I am you directly, Len?
Sure.
Yeah, Len's a really approachable, friendly person, so feel free to reach out to him. We're going to turn off the recordings now, so if you're on the Zoom call, don't worry. We aren't recording. Whatever you say, Len may judge you, but I won't. See you guys. And that was sarcastic, by the way. I'll cut